Has it started? Yes, yes. Yeah, so if you are just coming in, hello. Oh, hi, Jake. Nice to see you. We have several members of our core group. We are the Human-Wildlife Interactions Working Group of the Conservation Translocation Specialist Group of IUCN. If you are new, if this is the first time you're joining us, we are open group for people who are practitioners or researchers or students interested in conservation translocations. There's something strange happening here, a transcript. Is it just for me? Am I the only one who can see it? Okay, that's fine.
I think so.
New. As I was saying, so the point of the group is to support people who are interested in working with conservation translocations. And we have a website with resources that you can look into. We have we've been together since 2018, so we have several talks. Sean, you're here. Hello. I was apologizing for you not being here, and now you are. I'm glad to know. So I think we can start with the presentations. We have with us today two researchers from San Diego Wildlife Alliance, San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. It was very fortunate because I met both of them when I was doing a workshop. We had an integrative conservation clinic workshop in February, March with Alison Gregor. And it's a very interesting project. You can find more information about this as well. I'll share a link later. But it was the workshop was very interesting, and it was fantastic meeting Kirsty and Bethy. And from this kind of conversations came the theme for our talks today. So today we're focusing on considering social dimensions and well-being of local communities and wildlife conservation, implications for our type of projects. And our first speaker, we're going to invert the sequence of the talks. Oh, just before that, next week, today we have human well-being outcomes of conservation programs with Bethy, and the social dimensions of livelihood, poverty, well-being. And wildlife conservation will be next week with Gladman. He's also here with us. So we start with Kirsty today, and then we go to Bethy. Okay. So Kirsty is a social scientist in the Conservation Science and Wildlife Health Department at San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliances, and she oversees and supports social science and evaluation work to advance the Alliance's conservation field programs, strengthening connections between community goals and wildlife conservation efforts around the world. But I'll let Kirsty introduce herself and her work better, and you'll be sharing your screen with us in a moment. Yeah,
perfect. Thank you so much, Adriana. Let's see, I am going to set this up.
So while Kirsty is doing that, I'll ask everyone to mute your microphones now, and we'll have Kirsty talk, and then Bethy's talk, and then at the end we'll have time for questions and for discussion. So please take notes, think about how the talks relate to your practice and what kind of ideas you'd like to bring over and into discussion, and we'll have plenty of time for that afterwards. Okay. Great
Perfect.
stuff.
Thanks, Adriana. Just to tech check that you can see the slides? It looks okay? Great. All right. Yeah, thank you again so much for the invitation to speak to this group today. Like Adriana mentioned, I met her as well as Carlos earlier in the year when we were thinking through how to connect conservation practitioners with tools, resources, information relevant to translocations, and then got speaking a little bit more about this group that you're all a part of and how we could potentially contribute a talk to kind of the regular meeting. So I'm going to start with a bit of background on our organizational approach to conservation planning at San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance and share just a few examples of projects that support translocation initiatives. And then my colleague Bethy will present next, giving a deeper dive into some of our approaches and processes for monitoring social outcomes from conservation. Then we'll close kind of with more of an open discussion session. I'm happy to take questions together with Bethy after both of these slide decks. So a few years ago, my organization, we reorganized as the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, and this was really to concentrate our conservation work into 8 kind of eco regions, which we refer to as hubs. So if you hear that word, it's a bit of an internal term, but it's just become regular in our nomenclature. So you'll hear Bethy and I probably refer to it. Really, it's these kind of concentrated focuses for our conservation work. And the reasoning was multifold, but what really this did was bring a larger focus to our conservation partnerships and emphasize really the interconnectedness of people, wildlife, and the environment. At the San Diego Zoo and San Diego Zoo Safari Park, those two parks bring together upwards of 5 million visitors each year. And of course, we work to connect their visit and experience with how conservation is then happening in the wild in these places. You can see a few target species listed here, but each hub has many more conservation targets. And over the last 2 or so years, we've been working to adopt and apply the conservation standards cycle for adaptive management across our conservation science and wildlife health department. And this department houses teams that specialize in different disciplines like recovery ecology, conservation genetics, wildlife nutrition, community engagement, where Bethy and I work, and more. And one real benefit of using the same planning framework has been to highlight similar approaches in different spaces where we previously more or less were not just working in isolation, but it's just that our opportunities for collaboration were just that. They're a little more opportunistic. I'm going to share a few examples, and a lot of those actually did come out of collaborative conversations, but not necessarily the same kind of planning framework. So when we're bringing together these hubs, it really brought to light that translocations were one of these tools or approaches that span a lot of these different hubs that internally we were using. And so earlier this year, like Adriana mentioned, teams working on these programs met together with other colleagues to consider key questions, techniques, and background information that support effective translocation planning. And this workshop was hosted and driven by this developing platform. It's called Integrative Conservation Clinic, which I think will launch soon. So definitely keep an eye out for that. I'm sure that Adriana will share more when it is formally launched. But really, it got us thinking about how to even better integrate human dimensions with translocation projects. And a key piece of this, of course, would be prioritization, because there's numerous questions to ask and answer at different phases of the translocation cycle. But our group at San Diego Zoo is still a kind of growing and establishing conservation social science team. So we won't kind of be able to match all of those needs. And so a big part of it is kind of aligning with some of these key information needs and how that matches up with conservation planning and design cycles. So I just want to kind of touch a bit on the history of our team, which we kind of call ourselves Applied Conservation Social Science, and there's 4 of us. We've been building over the last 7 or 8 years, and we have this vision to support more and more of the hubs. Historically, a lot of our work has been concentrated in just a few, namely work in Kenya as well as Southeast Asia, addressing challenges associated with human-wildlife conflict and illegal wildlife trade. But so much of this work shares processes that are relevant to translocation planning, such as thinking through engagement processes, dialogue with communities, approaches for community monitoring of wildlife, and how to collect information kind of through those project cycles so that we can grow and change over time. So we're chatting a bit while we were setting up this session, and I noted that this situation that we're in is probably not unique because of kind of such a historical lean toward the biological sciences with conservation. There's certainly a recognition that kind of human dimensions is critical and key, but oftentimes groups are growing those more slowly, and so there's still probably a mismatch in terms of like there's still sometimes a lean toward biological sciences. And so I'm saying this to recognize that we are still in developing stages, and we're kind of working through what works well in applied conservation settings. So how to narrow into questions that are most pertinent to many different actors within conservation spaces, not just practitioners, but community leaders, members, et cetera. And when we were meeting earlier this year for this workshop, we definitely used this kind of figure of this conservation translocation cycle from the IUCN guidelines as sort of something to come back to think through where human dimensions questions would be relevant at different stages. And so I am going to share 3 examples today that more or less slot into these phases of the cycle. Of course, I want to recognize it would be so great to have social science support kind of throughout, but kind of our reality as we were building and growing was coming in at some of these different phases in existing programs. So the first example I'm going to share, I'd say that it probably falls more so in this implementation phase, and it has to do with alala reintroduction on the island of Hawaii. So alala are native to Hawaii and considered extinct in the wild. They have an important role in native forests for seed disbursement along with other native forest birds. Conservation agencies across Hawaii have been working really tirelessly for many years to protect and restore Hawaiian forests so that eventually alala can be thriving in the wild. So these agencies span from the State Department of Land and Natural Resources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, community groups, other conservation organizations like Three Mountain Alliance. And then there are a few kind of bird conservation centers that are managed by San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance that focused on captive rearing of alala for the last 2+ decades. There was a release effort from 2016 to 2019 in the Pu'umaka'ala Natural Area Reserve on Hawaii Island. And for various reasons, the last few individuals were brought kind of back into human care after a series of mortality events. And those were multifold, but one piece that is clear from the monitoring of that reintroduction effort was the importance of quality habitat. And so it very much highlighted that for successful reintroductions in the future will require habitat management to restore and protect native forests, as well as non-native predator control and management of captive alala that can then be supported with the kind of broader public support, outreach, and education. And so this kind of highlighted an opportunity to connect the alala recovery efforts with a more tailored environmental education program with partnering schools. And so in 2018, I want to say, the Alala Community Inquiry Program was established to support and engage Hawaii Island science teachers and their students through inquiry-based learning around the role of alala and native forest birds in conservation. And so the hope is that by engaging students with scientific investigations that focus on the alala, there'll be kind of this discovery of ecological significance of these birds, and then that can kind of open the door for efforts to act in environmental stewardship in these places as well. And so the data we collected in specific to this program was structured more as an environmental education program evaluation. So we collected data across 5 campuses on Hawaii Island. And we kind of measured through this structured questionnaire a series of variables like self-efficacy for science. So on a scale, one of the items was, I am confident in my ability to explain science topics to others. Another variable was self-efficacy for the environment. So this one example scale item was, I'm confident in my ability to help protect wildlife species. We measured general environmental beliefs, such as the scale statement, it's important to take good care of Hawaiian wildlife. Connections to nature, such as my relationship to nature is an important part of who I am. And then we also had more specific statements to alala. So these statements referred to beliefs and attitudes about alala and alala recovery, such as recovering alala through captive rearing and reintroduction is a good thing. So then taking those data and doing a principal component analysis to cluster these items, and then we looked at the relationships between these variables and those independent variables, kind of looking at the relationships between those and those alala specific statements. There were significant relationships between a few of those constructs. So student scores for connection to nature exhibited the strongest relationship on those alala specific statements, that mean variable for alala that we call alala human dimensions. And the mean scale for connection to nature was also lower than some of the other variables, which really presents this opportunity for growth in this area. Whereas sometimes with some of these measures for environmental education, we can see ceiling effects. And so it's harder to kind of see that change over time. So this is just kind of one example of how our environmental education program evaluation research helps to kind of narrow in on a few areas that can be emphasized or highlighted in some of the outreach support run out of Keaho Bird Conservation Center. This is just a very small snippet of a much, much larger program. I want to mention this work was led and supported by Bryce Masuda and Maggie Reinbold, as well as a student fellow we worked with on this named Kim Doe. The Alala project has extensive partners and funders and participating schools. So for the next example, I wanted to highlight one that isn't so much rooted in data from human dimensions questions, but more so thinking through engagement processes and some of the other ways to engage with communities throughout this translocation cycle. So this next one highlights work in that monitoring phase. So the HWIWG, which translates to giraffe guards in Swahili, is a community-based initiative in northern Kenya working to protect some of Kenya's giraffe species, which there are 3. For the northern giraffe, there was this kind of isolated population in Lake Baringo, in this the lake next to Ruko Community Conservancy, that over while these giraffe were eventually kind of isolated on this smaller island, and as rising waters kind of were threatening to kind of push them into smaller and smaller area, as well as concerns about the forage availability on this island, Kenya Wildlife Service decided to translocate each of these giraffe to a mainland sanctuary at Ruko Community Conservancy. And so Kenya Wildlife Service led a very successful operation to move these giraffe, but then there were questions about how to see how well these giraffe were doing after the translocation, and which is kind of how and why the HWIWG became involved. So one of my and Bethy's colleagues named Jenna, Stacy Dawes, has worked with the HWIWG team at Ruko to do post-release monitoring of this giraffe within this fenced sanctuary. But then there are broader questions about how to repopulate that giraffe population long-term and eventually have them roaming outside of these fences, as well as how and what they would need to thrive in terms of quality habitat. So that highlighted the need for further community engagement in these areas. There was a massive emphasis placed on community sensitization kind of right after that translocation. But for this goal of a breeding population of giraffe, there's this need to continue to work with these 2 communities within Ruko Community Conservancy to build support. and to think through how to monitor wildlife populations, see how they're doing into the future. And so one of our other colleagues, Tomas Pickering, has worked to drive this recent pilot of community-based monitoring through community camera trapping. So this is adapting an approach that was is a great case study led by Lion Landscapes in Tanzania of how to work through community monitoring with community managed camera traps. And so right now, the RUCO team has been piloting out this community camera trapping model and they're in their first performance period now. So this is one example of how, the focus is instead on engagement processes following translocation rather than supporting with some of these human dimension data collection efforts. For this work, the Conservancy Manager, Rebi Sabai, is massively important to this effort, along with partners at Northern Rangelands Trust, the HWIWG like Robert Sotua and Koryang. Of course, I mentioned our colleague Tomas Pickering and others. For this last example, I want to highlight something earlier in the process. So like I mentioned, our social science team is thinking through how to support and integrate with many established programs. And so oftentimes that's coming in a little bit further down the line. This example provides an opportunity for what it would be like to collect data before a translocation, which is really exciting. So the black rhino population in Kenya has been growing, thanks in large part to emphasis placed on their recovery and action plans. It's growing to the point where the existing sanctuaries are nearing capacity. And so Kenya Wildlife Service is thinking through, additional sanctuaries to expand to. And so after numerous assessments, they've conditionally approved expansion to an area called Loisaba Conservancy, which is located in Laikipia County in northern Kenya. And this involved a number of factors, habitat assessments, trying to find individuals for this in source populations. But an important emphasis was placed on community assessments and asking questions about social feasibility for moving rhino to this area. And so here are some of our colleagues at Loisaba, Lan Languya and Rita Raleigh, who are monitoring the fence line that was put in. There's also great work done around minimizing adverse impacts to non-target species, so how other wildlife species are interacting with these fences. But a large effort was placed on collecting information from communities to think through what their expectations were for a planned translocation, what that would mean for community engagement into the future. I want to note that the translocation hasn't occurred yet. Again, it's still under conditional approval that Kenya Wildlife Service is working through their processes and protocols to plan that hopefully in the near future. But again, based on their best available science. But what we did in this instance was provide some information about how surrounding communities to Loisaba felt about this translocation. So I'm going to close by just sharing a few of the descriptive stats that helped to inform what and how outreach can be tailored to build community understanding of these plans, and as well as note their expectations for the planning. Let's see, about a year ago, these interviews were conducted with the surrounding community conservancies to Loisaba, and about 59% of the respondents were aware of the upcoming rhino translocation, again, planned. 88% were in support of the overall translocation plan. And then we also asked questions about their previous experiences, positive or negative, not only with rhino, but other wildlife and other conservation agencies and entities. 44% of the respondents had never seen a rhino, and an additional 22% hadn't seen one in over 10 years. It's been about 40 or so years since black rhino were on this landscape. So some of Loisaba's efforts have been focused on those sensitization, almost field trips to places like Olpechta Conservancy so that people could see and experience rhino and think about what a translocation would mean for their community's plans and development. Like I mentioned, a few of the kind of key areas that we are interested in had to do with those expectations, both positive and negative, of the translocation plans. So one of the questions we asked was, following the rhino translocation, do you expect any negative impacts to you and your household in these following areas? kind of just thinking about pure percentage and saying yes or no to these different categories, the three highest areas were restrictions of movement, potential risks associated with poachers in the landscape, as well as grazing conflicts. And so this highlighted a few areas for Loisaba's community development officer to follow up in dialogue on what this would mean. I want to point out the aspects of movement and grazing has to do with a kind of grazing share plan between Loisaba and community conservancies. And so communities in this case had questions about what it would mean for their agreements for community livestock to graze on Loisaba during drought and dry seasons. And so this was relevant because the area of the rhino sanctuary was nearby some of these community conservancies. And so in this case, this highlighted for the community officer to speak through what changes to that program would make sense so that both those community needs can make sense, could still be met, as well as establishing the fenced rhino sanctuary. On the flip side, for these beneficial categories, the major ones that stood out were expectations around income, conservation, tourism jobs, security jobs. And so this is important to note that there were these expectations associated with the rhino translocation, but also generated conversations about kind of what potential opportunities would be reinforced by having something like a high-profile translocation, such as, rhino-specific monitors. But it also kind of brought together some conversations around how expectations of community well-being and human well-being can link to broader programs at Loisaba that aren't even specifically tied to the black rhino translocation. And so this really builds into a question that Bethy will explore in the next presentation. But again, just one final example of what some of the questions we asked before the translocation to think through how community outreach can be tailored. This all brought about broader considerations about our frameworks and approaches for social monitoring, which really built toward the project that Bethy's leading now, and we'll tell you more about. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then let's see, and pass it over to Bethy.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kirsty. It's very interesting. There are lots of questions in my mind already. So everyone, I'm gonna want to ask you again to hold your questions to the end. Everyone is gonna have a chance to unmute and ask questions. And just a reminder that we are recording the event and we'll be able to share it later with everyone who's present and everyone who can access our website. So our next talk is by Dr. Bethlehem Astella, Bethy, and who I also had the pleasure to meet when I went to San Diego Zoo. And Bethy is a postdoctorate associate with the community engagement team at San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. Her work focuses on co-developing measurement tools and indicators to track progress in social outcomes of the Alliance conservation programs and community engagement practices in close partnership with local partners and community groups. I know Bethy's work she's been working in different countries in Africa, and we will share resources and papers with everyone as well later on. Bethy.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Before I proceed, can you all see my screen? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here and get to present some of our work focused on social outcome monitoring and evaluation to this group, and also get the opportunity to learn a little bit more about translocation work more broadly. So as Adriana introduced, I work with the community engagement team at San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, currently focusing on developing or co-developing measurement tools that track progress and social outcome monitoring and evaluation. And that is what today's discussion will be on. So to give a little bit of an outline, I'll start with a brief overview of the project, talking about the different phases and also the expected outcomes or objectives for this broader project. I will spend most of the time talking about the first phase of this project, which will be focused on co-developing locally meaningful or relevant well-being indicators. And here I'll be highlighting some of our work focusing on workshops we've been conducting with partners in the Ebo Forest in Cameroon and Loisaba Conservancy, which Kirsty had been touching on in Kenya. I will also be highlighting some of the focus group discussions we've conducted with different groups of community members as part of our efforts to co-develop or generate meaningful measurements of human well-being outcomes in these landscapes. And then I will wrap up talking about where we are in this process and highlighting how we're planning on moving forward to the next phase of this project, which will be applying the indicators we've developed to assess differences in human well-being outcomes across different community groups, but also linking them to conservation outcomes, or what that implies to some of the socially oriented conservation strategies that we have in place. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a background on social outcome monitoring and evaluation. As we all know, over the past 5 decades or so, there's been a somewhat encouraging shift in conservation from conservation approaches that are exclusionary, top-down, towards more community-based, collaborative, and rights-based approaches. And along with this increasing shift, we're also seeing increasing emphasis or calls for impact-based outcome evaluation, or demonstrating effectiveness of our conservation strategies, both in terms of their social outcomes and also ecological outcomes. But it's also very important to understand when we're talking about outcome evaluation, especially in relation to conservation programs that are socially oriented or do have some human dimension components. In fact, most conservation strategies do have human elements underlying them, but it's also important to think about some of the social changes and processes. More specifically, for example, when we think about conservation strategies, thinking more about the nature of the inclusive nature of decision-making space, how different the rights and the priorities of different groups are respected in conservation decision-making. So understanding the underlying social changes and processes is equally important when we're thinking about measuring outcomes and impacts. And in these discussions, it's becoming increasingly understood that when we think about equity, representation, decision-making space, recognizing rights and priorities, incorporating communities at the center of outcome evaluation, or co-generating locally meaningful dimensions of human well-being is also becoming recognized, or the need to incorporate community perspectives throughout that decision-making process is also being highlighted. So with this general overview on the importance of community engagement in social monitoring and evaluation, I'll give a little bit of an overview about the current project we're working on. This project, as Kirsty mentioned, is somewhat in line with the broader organizational approach that we're following as far as aligning different conservation ecoregions, also known as hubs, and in a strategic planning framework. And therefore, along with these efforts of strategizing different programs and approaches, monitoring and evaluation specifically focusing on the social outcomes of our conservation strategies is also a big emphasis. So we identified 3 case study hubs that we recognize have long-standing experiences with community engagement efforts, but also cover different geographical, bicultural areas. and also give us a broad array of programs that cover different programmatic focus. For example, the Africa Forest Hub is focused with projects we have in the Ebo Forest in Cameroon, and it focuses on primarily primates and mammal conservation initiatives, working alongside communities in the Ebo Forest. And its emphasis is more on stakeholder and community engagement in land tenure management efforts. We also have projects in the site that Kirsty's been mentioning about, which is Loisabo Conservancy in Kenya, that has programs and strategies in place to offer diverse livelihood diversification options, also initiatives to promote human-wildlife coexistence initiatives through partnership with communities that live around the conservancy. The Pacific Islands program in Hawaii, Kirsty has also mentioned the Alala Community Inquiry Program that aspires to engage students, but also teachers in education programs and linking that to relocation efforts. So as you can tell, these 3 different case studies cover different programmatic areas of focus, but they each have strong social components embedded in them. And by identifying these case studies, we wanted to make connections with the broader organizational goals as they relate to social outcomes, which include promoting human-wildlife coexistence, in enhancing knowledge sharing with communities in a way that's equitable, but also cultivating leadership in partnership with surrounding communities. So each of these different case studies align with 3 of the overall socially oriented goals that the organization has. And our objective with this project was to use this case studies as samples on which we can build indicators to be able to track outcomes in the social outcomes of these strategies. But also the goal was to not only focus on this case studies, but to hopefully develop indicators that can be used and adapted across different strategies, across different programs. And the translocation effort that Kirsty's been mentioning that are currently underway or planned in some of our other hubs, the hope is they do have strong social component, and we're hoping the human well-being indicators that we're currently developing will also be used as these programs develop, as well as for other socially oriented strategies that we have across hubs in the organization. For the purpose of this discussion, I'll be focused on the current work that we are conducting in the Africa Forest and Savannah Hub, where our next projects phase will focus on the Pacific Highlands Hub. So human well-being as a tool for social outcome evaluation, that is the general lens we're adopting for this social monitoring and evaluation work. And this stems from the existing tradition where economic or material evaluation has taken prominence when it comes to outcome evaluation. So there is an increasing recognition that economic or material benefits alone cannot adequately capture the different ways in which people relate to the natural world, benefit from it, as well as how conservation strategies impact their well-being. So a more holistic approach is needed. There's also been challenges with programs or measurement tools that have been externally devised, not capturing the local nuances. So aspects such as historical relationship that people have with land, the political context of different communities are not adequately captured with program tools that have been developed elsewhere. And then there's also the issue of equity and communities' heterogeneity, the need to approach the diversity in different groups, whether that is along the lines of gender, age, livelihood strategy, or a number of other factors. But there's also that need to capture the heterogeneity and the diversity in communities. Therefore, our approach with human well-being is more or less as a more holistic approach to capture the different ways in which people relate to the natural world and the ways in which conservation strategies could be impacting their well-being. So in addition to the more traditionally used concepts like the basic material well-being, which refer to the income, employment opportunities that people have, we also wanted to encompass other dimensions of well-being in relation to conservation strategies, including, for example, freedom of choice, which talks about people's abilities to lead the life they choose, concepts such as the relational values that people have with the natural world, ancestral rights, spiritual values, also thinking about health, including concepts such as medicinal plants and animals that people use from the natural world, so social relationships that are brought about, encompassing security. So all of these were human well-being with a more holistic or all-encompassing framework we wanted to adopt as a way of looking at the multiple ways in which people relate to the world, to the natural world, and also conservation strategies impact them. Another equally useful framework was thinking about nature's contribution to people. And this approach, thinking about ecosystem services as the benefits that people get from the natural world, but also thinking about it not in a unidirectional approach, but also thinking about all the non-linear ways in which people's well-being is impacted by nature, or people affect the natural world. So thinking about culture not just as one discrete component of ecosystem services, but more broadly thinking about culture as a broader lens through which we can think about people's relationship to the natural world. So thinking more about the relational values that emerges when we think about culture as a broader lens in which we're thinking about the values that nature contributes. So a more broader and holistic approach to conceptualizing people's relationship with nature. So the way we went about this project, after thinking through a broader framework that we can apply that encompasses multiple dimensions of human well-being, was first to approach our project partners and thinking about brainstorming a theory of change that focuses on social outcomes. Currently, as Kirsty was mentioning, our organization is going through the conservation standards framework that is aligning many of our hubs in a strategic planning framework. And so the work that we conducted with our partners, specifically focusing on socially oriented strategies, was to have a workshop session in which we first identified what are some of the key socially oriented strategies of focus. What are the key strategies that we should be focusing on? And then under each strategy, we talked about what are the different outcomes that are expected from each. And so thinking back about the human well-being framework that I just talked about, what are the different well-being outcomes you expect will result from the strategy when it comes to, for example, security, when it comes to health, when it comes to the more direct benefit that people may get in terms of employment opportunities or livelihood diversification options from the strategy. So we had a brainstorming session thinking about different socially oriented strategies as well as the expected outcomes. But more importantly, it was about unboxing the assumptions underlying the strategies and expected outcomes. So thinking through the specific steps to get to from the strategy to the expected outcome. So talking through some of the contextual factors that could be shaping our expected outcomes, be it economic factors, cultural factors, social factors. So it was a session to walk through some of them underlying assumptions shaping our strategies and the intended social outcomes. We also had a session, the session also included discussions about equity, thinking about communities as a heterogeneous, a very diverse group of people. we were talking about how our conservation strategies could vary in their outcomes depending on who the groups were thinking about could be, whether that's along the lines of gender, thinking about age, and livelihood, among other factors. So here I wanted to highlight two of the socially oriented strategies that we chose in the Ebo Forest and in the Lusaba Conservancy in Kenya. I want to highlight that we did have a number of other strategies that we identified in each, but for the purpose of this discussion, I'll be focusing on two key strategies. So this is a very simplified theory of change model that we used during the workshops. The first strategy highlighted in yellow is, for example, from the Ebo Forest, in which the overall strategy is promoting sustainable alternative livelihoods. And under this strategy, we have a number of activities, including, for example, providing market linkages to communities, providing machines such as cassava grinding machines to communities as a way of promoting sustainable alternative livelihoods. And what's highlighted in blue is the intermediate results. So some of the expected outcomes from this strategy are providing increased and diversified livelihood or household income, with the objective, with the expectation that that will in turn lead to increased awareness, promoting attitudes and a change in behavior, with a goal that this will in turn lead to wildlife being conserved, and then human well-being targets being achieved through ecosystem services. And then the second strategy, this one coming from Kenya, for example, is supporting sustainable human-wildlife coexistence through a number of activities such as providing wildlife deterrence to communities, organizing communities, and self-help associations such as the Chui Mama Center, which is a women-led association that aims to incorporate women in wildlife conservation activities through offering a number of self-help initiatives. And therefore, the expectation that this program will also empower or enable communities in effective livestock management techniques, which will in turn lead to a decline in human-wildlife conflict. Recognizing this is a very oversimplified theory of change model, where we approach, or how we approach the strategy, is to recognize human well-being targets or human well-being outcomes are not only filtered through ecosystem services as is traditionally presented, but when we have socially oriented strategies, we can also think about where we can integrate or how we can incorporate human well-being targets in relation to those socially oriented strategies as well. So in this framework, we embedded, or in our discussions, we incorporated the equity conscious and culturally sensitive lens, as we mentioned, the questions about how different groups benefit or could possibly be affected by the conservation strategy, but also thinking more broadly about the contextual factors, the enabling factors, whether positive or negative, that could be shaping outcomes, such as historical factors, socioeconomic or political factors going on in these communities. Just to highlight some of the results from the workshops we conducted with our partners in Kenya with the LEOPARD program, with a strategy that is focused on supporting sustainable human-wildlife coexistence. This was the input of the project team. Some of their expected social outcomes are more direct, for example, in relation to reducing livestock loss, enabling communities to generate income, fostering cooperation across communities, for example, in the process of instilling some of this wildlife deterrence, promoting knowledge and skills sharing. These were some of the benefits that the project team identified as being linked to this specific strategy. And then thinking more about the contextual factors or the enabling conditions, they also identified how longstanding community relations, the fact that there's a longstanding partnership between Lusawa Conservancy and the surrounding community conservancies that was highlighted as a strength. They talked about how community-driven scientific approach, including community members in participating in wildlife monitoring, in terms of identifying factors that shape people's acceptance or tolerance levels in terms of coexisting with wildlife. The fact that there is a strong local buy-in in participating in some of these initiatives. These were some of the key opportunities that the group identified. But they also identified key challenges or threats, including, for example, issues of human health priorities, the fact that there are a number of disease outbreaks that also affect the effectiveness of these strategies, issues with bureaucratic or administrative hurdles, the issues of trust were also some of the factors that were highlighted by the project team as being some of the challenges that affect the strategy from achieving its intended outcome. And we also talked about equity concerns in relation to this program, where they talked about how the community identification process itself, specifically thinking about wealth disparities between communities and how that could influence the equitability of the BOMA distribution or the wildlife deterrent distribution initiatives. The fact that women are not livestock owners and how that can also hinder the effectiveness of the equitability of some of these initiatives were among the key equity concerns that were brought up in relation to the human-wildlife coexistence strategy with the leopard program. So this was, of course, a multi-stage process. So we wanted to have a grounded understanding of how the project team was expecting these strategies to play out in terms of the expected outcomes, the factors that could be shaping these strategies, and also the equity considerations. And then with that background, we approached the community groups. And when it came to communities, our objective was having a very grounded understanding of how well-being is conceptualized or is constructed by different community groups. So we posed questions such as, what are the key aspects of life that are needed to live well in this community? What are some of the natural resources, or how does nature contribute to your well-being in this community? We wanted to have an understanding of local norms and customs in relation to human-wildlife coexistence. And we also wanted to have an understanding of people's perceptions to changes to their well-being and also to the status of natural resources over time. So these were some of the probing questions we asked. And as a way of gauging or incorporating an equity-conscious well-being framing, we adopted this multidimensional equity framework. And our objective was, when it comes to conservation strategies and how they affect people's well-being, we wanted to incorporate a distributive dimension of well-being, thinking more about how our benefits distributed across groups, a recognition component of equity, thinking more about how and to what extent are different cultures, cultural values, spiritual values, knowledge systems being incorporated in the decision-making space, and who is participating in that decision-making space. And also thinking a little bit more broadly about the broader context too, about what factors, what broader economic, environmental factors, or social factors could be shaping outcomes. And so, based on this broader equity framework, in the leopard program in Kenya, we identified 4 main groups. And for our focus group discussions, where we held separate discussions with women, with men, youth, and conservancy board members. These were the key groups that were identified as being key groups to incorporate or to hold separate discussions with in relation to the human well-being outcomes of the leopard program. And then similarly in the Ebo Forest in Cameroon, we held 15 focus group discussions with separate groups of women, men, elders, as well as CAG and CAC members who are gorilla and chimpanzee clubs, which are community-based associations that have been established through our partners in the Ebo Forest, called the Cameroon Biodiversity Association, which is a partner to San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. And then we also included members of ACTRIF, which is an association of elders. That is an organization that tries to assert the needs and priorities of communities living inside the Ebo Forest, but also groups that have ancestral claims to the Ebo Forest living outside of the forest. Here, based on the broader multidimensional equity framework, I wanted to highlight some of the key findings from the focus group discussions in relation to basic material well-being. Some of the key thematic codes that emerged from the community discussions included, for example, people's reliance on natural resources as sources of food, not only non-timber forest products, but also wildlife as source of food or income. There were key thematic codes that emerged in relation to people's key well-being demands in relation to community infrastructure and services, agricultural or livelihood, livestock improvement tools. These were some of the key themes in relation to the more material well-being dimension that emerged. And then key thematic codes in relation to freedom of choice came up in relation to ancestral rights or heritage. Especially people that weren't living inside the forest, talked about the reverence or the attachment that they have, the sense of place they feel in relation to their ancestral rights to the Ebo Forest. We also found themes in relation to women being involved in natural resource decision-making, including, for example, participating in some of the, having greater decision-making role in some of the community-based association that were in place in the Ebo Forest. Key dimensions of health also were brought up in relation to people's desire for access to medicinal plants, animals in the Ebo Forest. There were key thematic codes that came up in relation to secure and reliable livelihoods. These themes related to how people talked about security from wildlife attacking humans, security from wildlife attack on crops, but also another key thematic code that came up was livelihood options, secure livelihoods, especially for youth that do not have access to land. And then social relation or in relation to social connectedness, key thematic quotes such as trust and collaboration within groups, but also the communication, the relationship, the access to information that people have to external organizations were also brought up. So this is like in a nutshell, some of the key thematic quotes that emerged from the focus group discussions we held both in Cameroon and Kenya. But of course, the specifics are separate for each of them, but I wanted to highlight what were like the key human well-being thematic quotes that emerged from these discussions as they relate to all the different dimensions of well-being. I also wanted to pull out a few quotes. For example, this is interesting in relation to some of the more basic material dimensions of well-being that were brought up. As I've shown in the previous slide, basic material well-being, including access to non-timber forest products, access to community services with the key thematic quote. But it's also important to realize how basic material well-being was highly interrelated with many other dimensions of human well-being, including freedom of choice, or the ability of people to lead a life of their choice, and how that is in turn related to how people perceive nature is contributing to their well-being. So as you can see here, lack of access to roads and also access to nearby markets is severely impacting people's ability to transport their products out to the market. And this is closely related to the current efforts to diversify livelihoods to the communities, where people are still resorting to hunting wildlife or harvesting barks of trees as a way, as a result of lack of options, as a result of their inability to find access to markets or be able to export their products out to the market. So it was interesting to note how a key dimension of material well-being was also strongly related to other thematic codes that came up in relation to freedom of choice and people's inability to have options as a way of diversifying their livelihood. Other dimensions were in relation to social connections and empowerment, specifically in relation to women groups. It was highlighted that the opportunity, and it, besides livelihood diversification, women strongly alluded to how being in the presence of other women, the ability or access to network with other women was something that they strongly valued as a key part of their well-being. And that is in turn contributing to their empowerment through access to information, being able to earn money. This is a quote that was pulled from the Lusaba Conservancy, the Chui Mama Center, where women strongly valued the social connectedness that was enhanced through the women network groups that were in place. Another aspect of well-being that was brought up in relation to social cohesion had a lot to do with communal rights. People talked about how through natural resources, they have found a way of channeling or coming together to assert their common voice. So people were talking about how in their communities, there are a number of initiatives that are focused on natural resources, but they talked about how they're now coming together to identify which projects give the communities and their children heritage, prioritizing conservation projects, prioritizing initiatives that protect resources over other projects, for example, such as logging, which they consider to be not providing them a means to their heritage, a means to protect their heritage. But then there were also other quotes that came up in relation to communal rights, where people talked about the importance of conservation organizations or conservation strategies being in line with not only the needs of people to have access to direct access to the forest as a way of supporting their livelihoods, but also as a way of enabling them to defend their ancestral rights or maintain their connectedness to land. And other key dimensions that we also were able to pull from this community focus group discussions were a lot about participation and decision making. While it was very encouraging to see community-led, community-driven associations, both in the Ebo Forest as well as in Kenya, there were also a number of equity issues that were brought up in some of these discussions. For example, in the gorilla and chimpanzee club associations in Cameroon, a number of issues were brought up in relation to age, where youth, specifically those that did not have access to land, that were not household heads, presented issues of an inequitable participation in decision making, where the majority of decisions are dominated by elder men. And this was also a similar sentiment was also reflected by women, who also felt like decision-making space and some of these community-based associations did not incorporate or did not allow room for women to also have a representation or a voice, especially when it comes to decision-making. So with this general background on where we're at, where, as I mentioned, right now we just completed the first phase, a more qualitative phase of generating locally meaningful dimensions or indicators of human well-being through on one hand, workshop with our partners, but also focus group discussion with diverse community groups. But we're at a stage where now we're compiling those qualitative constructs of human well-being and developing indicators, more quantitative indicators that we're now hoping to link to our conservation strategies, and also to see differences in well-being dimensions across broader groups. So just to give you an outline, this is where we are in the process, where in green we have co-developed those indicators across the multiple dimensions of well-being we just talked about. But now we're moving to the stage where we're trying to link that to, for example, some of the program design characteristics, which came as a result of the discussions we held in the workshops, where we're thinking about the alignment of programs with local needs, cultural sensitivity, equity consciousness of these programs. And then we're planning on making connection to conservation outcomes, such as perceptions of coexistence with wildlife in relation to different factors, such as, for example, cultural or spiritual significance, economic or livelihood benefits in relation to conservation programs, perceptions of security, as well as respect and recognition given to historic and or heritage rights. And so at this point, we're compiling the well-being, the qualitative well-being construct we've developed, and developing quantitative constructs to measure well-being differences across communities and making connections to conservation outcomes. Yeah, so this is in a nutshell the work we've done in the two places, and our upcoming work, as Kirsty mentioned, will also include expanding this work to look at the Alala Community Inquiry Program, specifically focusing on community outreach and education. So thank you so much.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We had such wonderful talks. I must just say for the whole group, thank you very much for accepting to come and talk to us. And it's fantastic to have such wealth of research in human dimensions that apply to conservation in general, but to us in conservation translocations as well. So I'm going to open the floor to questions and then discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and I'm going to ask you if you can then, just unmute your microphone and also your camera, so we can have a conversation, and start by introducing yourself, okay? I think I'm going to just make use of the fact that I am talking and ask my first question. I wanted to ask Kirsty, you talked about the black rhino translocation that is in phase of planning, so all the community assessment taking place in the planning phase. And I was wondering how the findings are going to filter into the project. Can you talk a little bit about that? Please. You are muted. Please unmute yourself.
I think she's saying she's frozen.
Ah. Okay. I don't think I can do anything on this side. Let's see, maybe because you have to come back.
Yeah.
Okay. I can kind of hear someone. Does anybody want to ask another question before? Oh, how are you doing now, Kirsty?
This work now?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. There was a chat box that came up, and the only option it was giving me was to chat with Bethy, which I love to do, but it wasn't letting me unmute. So Adriana, sorry for the delay, but was your question about the process and how this information how the information about the initial community assessments being used?
Yes, how is it going to translate into changes in the project, or for the next phases, for the implementation?
Yeah, good question. So I think I'd say I'll answer on two different scales. One, the overall translocation process is driven and managed by Kenya Wildlife Services. It's under their jurisdiction to select translocation sites. So like I said, this is just conditional approval for Loisaba, and they're finishing their final assessments, but it was nice to see that an evolution of the translocation guidelines that they're using include and involve that community assessment as a requirement, kind of at that initial stage with habitat assessments and security assessments, et cetera. So on that level, we hope that the one outcome will be the kind of multiple time point touch points over time. So asking the same questions following the translocation 1 or 2 years. So then Kenya Wildlife Service will have, these types of rhino specific indicators to inform national scale planning into the future. But on a much more practical kind of immediate time scale, the data from the initial community interviews were incorporated by the Loisaba's community team for one, some of the key messages for their outreach. And so that's kind of one piece, particularly around there was an aspect of natural heritage that kind of came out. I didn't share that piece, but this piece about yes, I'd like to see rhinos. I want my kids to see rhinos in the future. There were a few kind of very vocal elders during kind of the initial scoping process that spoke about how they remember what it was like having rhinos in that landscape. So that's one piece, but then another really practical piece has to do with the expectations of costs and benefits. So particularly that table around expectations of costs had to do with expectations of benefits, there were expectations around employment, income, et cetera, which really highlights the need to focus on hiring practices by Loisaba so that it's transparent and viewed equitably, that the opportunities for employment and training opportunities are linked to conservation programs. It's clear like how that hiring process and recruiting process is linked to community boards and management, so that there's it really just kind of highlighted kind of that need to talk about how opportunities are matched between conservancy initiatives and community boards. So that was kind of one piece. Loisaba's has a human resource officer that's starting to go out into some of our community events, et cetera. So that's kind of one practical piece. So I answered that on both scales. Hopefully the information is incorporated at those multiple levels.
So there is a process in place, and it's built in so that they will respond, the other parts of the project will respond to your research.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. I think too, like one area where I'm not quite sure yet, but hopefully it will grow and evolve is so there was like also that aspect of security. It was seen as both a good and a potential bad thing. And so that's kind of one area where I think the conservation team could work really closely with the security teams and kind of focus on kind of the multiple dimensions of having heightened security in an area.
Thank you. Anyone, would you like to ask a question before I start asking more? Jake. Hi, Jake.
Hey. This is really great work. It's interesting too, I think, because obviously, so I'm at Los Angeles. We're very close, and I hear about a lot of the work that you're all doing, but obviously it's a large organization, so some of it doesn't necessarily filter out all the time, but this is really exciting work. And I don't have a necessarily specific question right now because I have too many things I'd like to talk with you about. So my question is, at some point, could maybe either, if you're up in LA, both of you, or maybe I can get my team down to you, because this is pretty much just, a lot of the similar work that we're doing and we're just getting started at. And I know that the team would benefit a lot from being able to talk with you directly and maybe developing a relationship. So that's more of my question. I think there's way too much to go over during this, but this was awesome. You're doing fantastic work.
Thank you. We'd love to follow up. No, that sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask a very general question, but asking Bethy, which has been an enormous, gigantic concern of mine lately, thinking about indigenous beliefs and indigenous communities. And it's about promoting and protecting the traditional indigenous livelihoods and finding the best way for these livelihoods to coexist with wildlife conservation. You're talking, Bethy, about the rights to land, to forest, to livelihood, to connection to land. And I keep thinking if we should put more focus and emphasis on protecting that. And then us as conservation biologists working for conservation biology to coexist with the traditional ways of it would be a different approach, I imagine. But I think this comes from the question that probably these people have been coexisting with wildlife their whole lives. Something changed, some imbalance happened, so conflict has increased. Do we need to focus on the drivers of the conflict as well as on increasing coexistence? I know it's a very complex set of ideas, but please, I'd love your input on that.
I think I will try to answer that, but also it might be a little bit broad. But maybe specifically talking about the Ebo Forest in Cameroon and some of the ongoing efforts they have to work alongside communities in this really massive effort to basically have more or less like a sustainable co-management of the entire landscape is something maybe that we can learn from. I think it's been a very long-standing initiative. The relationship that Zoo has with the Ebo Forest is around a 15-year old relationship, but even prior to that, there were a number of factors that drove communities away from the Ebo Forest, where the result of political factors, people had to flee the forest, and in that process, the forest was designated as a protected area, and therefore there's been that disconnect that people feel from the forest. And current initiatives or existing initiatives for the longest did not necessarily address the needs, the priorities that people have in relation to the forest, which is in some ways a little bit more complex. It's not only about the immediate drivers. For example, the immediate drivers are for people that live adjacent to the forest at the moment. But for those people, yes, I agree, working with them as far as understanding the immediate drivers for forest degradation, which could be logging demands, which could be livelihood demands, for instance, access to wildlife as a source of food. So those are some of the more immediate factors in relation to people that are living around the forest. But honestly, I think that comes back to also recognizing how diverse some community groups can be, and coming up with a multi-layered approach that recognizes and addresses this diversity. And this is what is being done right now. Yes, addressing livelihood demands through livelihood diversifying options is one of the initiatives, but also as part of this initiative to co-manage the forest, the voices of people that are living elsewhere, but also have ancestral claims, heritage claims to the forest is also being recognized. And that is something that is currently more or less working, because there are sites that are designated as being spiritual sites, burial sites, sites of specific historical, cultural significance, and then other areas are being set aside for as key biodiversity areas. So at least in the context of the EPO4, the way they're trying to go about it is having a multi-layered approach that recognizes immediate drivers in relation to specific groups, but also recognizes there are long-standing coexistent traditions that have at times been eroded, but can also be reignited as by working with communities over a long period of time, incorporating them in the broader landscape management plan that the project partners on the ground are working for. So yeah, depending on the context, depending on who the groups we're talking about are, recognizing their diverse needs and trying to come up with a multi-layered approach, I think that is something that I've seen working in the context of the Ebo Forest.
I think it's wonderful the way you talked about the shift, isn't it, from an excluding kind of conservation to a much more inclusive, and this focus on context, isn't it? On I like very much in one of your papers you're talking about the social sciences measurement tools like the Likert scale, and how you have to actually question the questions and evaluate that in local context to see if people are understanding the same thing that you are, and rephrase the way you ask things, and the importance of context when defining well-being, as you're saying. I think it's amazing. As I'm sure I mentioned before, we're going to be working on guidelines for human-wildlife interactions in conservation translocations as a companion guide to the conservation translocation guidelines that IUCN published in 2013. And I think there are so many elements from both your presentations that I don't want to be the only one talking. We have another 10 minutes, and I have a lot to say, people, but I would love to hear your voice, your opinions and your experiences in relation to measures of well-being, benefits to local communities related to your projects, and questions you might have. Oh, I have someone raised. Oh, Sean, thanks. I was hoping you would come in.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't really have any questions. I think the work you're doing is great. I think an awful lot of people now are realizing that conservation social science is a must-have in any project, not just in translocation projects. I think that what Bethy said about communities not being homogenous. I mean, I think that was that's been a huge mistake with conservation biologists. And I mean, really, conservation biology is about wildlife and it's not about people. So, I mean, people are just going to assume that you go into a community. And I think as well, we've got this, sometimes we've had this idea that they are somehow these lovely places, where there's total harmony and everything else. And of course, they're communities just like, the small community that I come from. There are people who don't get on with one another. There are different, there are dominant people, there are subordinate people. And I think that's where we've made a mistake. And I think, that's a huge plus in your approach in the Ebo Forest, is that you are kind of trying to include everybody and not just the elites. And not, just the very poor people who do need, perhaps some different intervention. So I think, I think that approach will probably bear quite a lot of fruit, hopefully, in the future. Thanks.
Fantastic, Sean. We've got Jake and then Carlos, but if you want to reply to Sean quickly, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean. Yeah, definitely recognizing that diversity in community, which is sometimes very challenging because there's so many different lines to incorporate different groups, but at least, you know, having those discussions with different groups, thinking about what are the more salient lines and how can we bring groups together. That's something that's currently working, but of course, you know, things are dynamic. They're constantly changing in these landscapes too. So being mindful of that change and how to constantly integrate this into you know, conservation planning, that adaptive management is also equally critical.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that's another mistake that we make. We don't understand that communities will change. I mean, you often get people being quite, you know, people in the West being quite disappointed that, you know, people in various ethnic minorities have got mobile phones, for example. It's like we expect them to be stuck in some place, you know, 50 years ago and to never change. And I think that's, you know, that's a relic of colonialism, really, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the dynamism and the you know, the diversity of communities is something that we haven't really dealt with. And I think, you know, that is a huge plus. And the fact that you're even just aware of it makes a huge difference, I think. Thanks.
I'm sorry you're going to have to rush the end, but Jake and then Carlos, I don't think we can take any more questions after that. But as I said, we're going to be sharing the recording and contacts and associated resources, okay? Let's, Jake and Carlos.
Yeah, I do have a question. I think you know, all this is kind of, unfortunately, I think, as Sean would say, is unfortunately relatively new territory in conservation. And so because you have this history, especially say in places like West Africa, of conservation being so exclusionary, and how do you actually like initially start those conversations with these local community groups when there can be often so much apprehension and like negativity because of historic, you know, wrongs that had happened there? Just to start those conversations to get it into a place where you can have the more meaningful, you know, illuminating workshops and things, because I think that might be a big barrier to a lot of us.
Definitely. I think this comes down to really a very long-standing and tireless work that conservation practitioners or conservation organizations on the ground are doing. Currently, we're working with Cameroon Biodiversity Association that's been working the Ebo landscape for close to 20 years, and they've done, you know, extremely tireless job as far as building relationships, building trust with the communities in those landscapes over those years. And, you know, this is a testament to their relentless effort. There's been many initiatives, even sometimes government-driven initiatives where there have been powerful political actors that have been for, you know, for example, extensive logging of the forest or other activities that were very detrimental to the forest, to the livelihoods of those communities. But they have persisted in terms of engaging with the communities over a long period of time, you know, and demonstrating that they are there for the long run. They are not just out there to protect, you know, the chimps and the gorillas, but really it's more about, you know, the well-being of the communities as it relates to the forest too. So yeah, for us coming in, I think because of that built-in relationship, it's been much easier for you know, partners such as ourselves to go into those communities and start these workshops, have these conversations about the future of the forest, the future of their, you know, the communities in that area. And I think this comes back to those that work that, you know, on the ground conservation organizations have been conducting over years.
I'll just throw in 2 quick resources. There's a really nice special issue led by Asha DeVos in Conservation Science and Practice, maybe last year, all around parachute science. And there were a few articles in there that talked specifically about processes for dialogue and how to set objectives that are shared. And I think a focus of our teams moving forward will hopefully be around kind of further documentation of those processes for consent with communities, and kind of agreement around what the parameters of conservation projects are, and really, more and more conservation programs will hopefully put emphasis on those FPIC guidelines. I think that will definitely be an important step moving forward too. So
it'd be great if you can share that with us, Cassie.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, Carlos.
Okay, I'm going to be quick because you want us to go away, so you want to close this.
It's
So
not my fault.
I'm going to have you. I'm going to ask you one of the short questions that requires a half-an-hour answer. No, it's no, you were saying that it was only you talking. It's a lot to digest. It's a lot of good stuff, and sitting here taking notes like if I was, like a student at school, and I finally stopped. It's just a lot of stuff. But I was thinking about, I like in one of the parts that you were talking about asking and finding out the people's expectations. What are your expectations with the reintroduction program? What are your fears? What do you think can go wrong for you, and what can you think is good for you? And then because we deal with that here, or I've been thinking about that here, because we support a lot of these agroforestry systems in tropic. You should do agroforestry with your, and then you'll plant, the forest plants, and then some forest plants that you'll harvest, and all of this stuff. And nobody really asks these people what their expectations are. And the animals that we want to protect and reintroduce, translocate, are going to harvest those same things is going to plant. You're going to create a economic competitors, between the animals, and nobody really asks people. And conservationists, and this is, sort of like, you should do this, but in reality, I think everybody's expecting that these farmers will take the brunt of the negative. I mean, assume the losses, because they should think like we think, but and it's just very interesting. And my question is going to be, okay, so now that you know the expectations, or what is your experience with this? Now that you know the expectations of this community, have you been able to really change the strategies of the conservation programs and the way things are done? Or are we just, now we know what their expectations are, but we're going to go business as usual? So what's the next step? Have you been able to deal with this successfully, so that you have really integrated and find solutions and so forth? That's it. My short question for a half-an-hour answer. We can.
It definitely warrants more discussion and more time than I think we have to give. And I'll say that I honestly don't have that experience, because we're so on the early stages of trying to incorporate, so that process of learning as we go, evolving as we go, we're hoping to engage with that. I will throw out there that one approach that we're thinking about, how to incorporate along the way, are a lot of the tools in conservation peace building. So conservation conflict transformation, that recognizes the dynamic nature of conservation conflicts over time, and what really is a durable solution, and how do you land on that. So one of the best trainings that I've been a part of is with Center for Conservation Peace Building, and some of them, or the director of that group, along with some practitioners, wrote a paper, I want to say last year, around conservation conflict transformation is specific to translocations. I think the case highlighted in that was around conservation of birds in Hawaii. So, so there was that example highlighted, because it's been such a long-standing effort. Our involvement in that work is just developing, so I can't speak from personal experience. I don't know, Bethy, would you like to kind of add in any specifics?
Yeah, maybe not from our current work, but some of the work that I've been involved with in Ethiopia has also been in relation to, after finding expectations, what next? And I think a big part of the problem has been, there have been a lot of mistrust that has come as a result of, unmet expectations, part of which was, conservation strategists making sometimes unrealistic but really grand promises to communities. So part of what we've been finding is, by learning what communities, the expectations, the hopes of communities are, and what the scope of a conservation organization is, it also helps with that communication for conservation organizations, re-strategizing some of their priorities, what is within the realistic limit of what a conservation program can do, and then being very honest and transparent in the communication as far as what a project can do and cannot. That itself goes a long way in terms of minimizing mistrust down the line. So that is one of the benefits, and also helping come up with more coordinated efforts, because sometimes we have a tendency to work in silos as conservation organizations, specifically focusing on some conservation outcomes, but thinking more broadly about how we can also partner up with other conservation development, for example, organizations, and then learning about where are our shared outcomes, and what are some objectives that are better targeted by other organizations. So yeah, being able to also come up with shared objectives for some of these expectations, that also has been something that's been found useful by learning about what are like the broader set of social expectations, well-being expectations that people have in these landscapes.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you for the
Betty.
answers and for sharing all of your work with us.
I was just going to say, are you okay to answer one more question? Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask Julie to introduce yourself. And this will be our last question today. And thanks everyone who stayed so far. I know it is quite overwhelming because there's a lot of information. And yeah, a lot of ideas.
Thanks a lot, first of all, for all you bring, all information you bring us today, and for all these sharings. So I'm working in some national park, for example, in Waza National Park in far north Cameroon, and I have worked also. It was in Waza in a human-elephant conflict, and also linked with the Kalfu forest area. In far north Cameroon, and I was also working in Maiko National Park in DRC, in other problems there. And so my question was two questions: where and how should we put the limit, for example, with tradition and ancestral rights, for example, the claims, the right to go and to use some pools, for example, water pools in national park, especially when it's the dry season, how we can manage, for example, when they want to dig some fishing channels, and it may go all the water from a national park, and when we can manage when they fish with mosquito nets, which takes all the eggs and things like that. So where should we put the limit and the collaborative? How could we not be invasive or things like that? And for example, you were talking about the youth and the elders. There also, how could we manage to listen everybody and not to be invasive and not to be, between brackets, a kind of colonialistic and putting some trouble in their relation, because the elders in Africa, for example, or in Asia, it's not the same reason. So where should we put the limits, and how can we balance that? Thank you very much.
Just before you answer, there is a comment from Paloma. And so Paloma works in Peru, and she's saying thanks for such wonderful presentations. I think to understand and construct definitions of well-being conservation itself is extremely important for this process and the future. Over here in Peruvian Amazon, this makes also the great challenge relating indigenous conservation, governance, rights over land use. So I think it addresses, your answer will address both. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. I think it's a really difficult, challenging question we're still grappling with. But you know, we have like demonstrated evidence of what happens when, you know, people's priorities, perspectives, value systems are not incorporated in conservation decision making. And so speaking specifically, for example, from experiences in the Ebo forest, because of differences in, for instance, community priorities, the priorities of conservation organizations, loggers, for the longest there's been an area of no action, you know, where the Ebo forest was not designated, to this day, still not designated as an official like protected area. And so I think one important way that they're trying to go about it is come up with a co-management strategy where, you know, together with communities, they're designating areas that are of specific cultural or livelihood significance for communities. So it's like a very expansive project that is taking into account the different priorities. And then there are some areas that are being designated as key conservation areas. And so this co-management approach is trying to incorporate, you know, the needs and priorities of the communities, whether these are driven by immediate livelihood needs, or whether these are in relation to, you know, traditional or historic heritage-based rights. So a management approach that is incorporating communities, you know, hearing their priorities and perspectives, also creating a room for dialogue where they're, you know, understanding the significance of protecting some species or some areas for generations to come, for their own well-being, but for also the broader, you know, sustaining the broader ecosystem. I think that is an understanding that is coming as a result of this inclusive process that is incorporating communities in this decision-making space. So different area, you know, management plan has been developed where some areas are designated for their specific historical significance, some are for their economic livelihood significance, and other areas are, you know, now being supported even by community members as being areas that are of critical conservation value and should be, you know, conserved. So yeah, having that community buy-in, but also allowing a room for diverse perspectives still be reflected in the process, that's been something that's been helpful, at least in the context of the Ebo forest, in managing this area as a multi-use conservation / you know, livelihood / heritage kind of co-managed area. And then when it comes to, yes, issues of empowerment, whether it's related to youth, women, those are very challenging areas. And we've been having this discussion with some of our women empowerment initiatives in Kenya too. But how do we go about, you know, promoting concepts of equity, empowerment, but at the same time remain respectful of existing traditional systems? And this goes back to the earlier point I made about how, you know, these landscapes, the systems are constantly evolving, in a constant state of change. And therefore, I think there's an opportunity for conservation organizations without implementing a very top-down approach, you know, finding, for example, local agents, local champions that are already working in this landscapes as far as like affecting or promoting changes. We work, for example, in Kenya with a women-led association, and a big part of the success for this women-led association is the fact that, you know, these are women that themselves have already been initiating some changes, whether it was in relation to education, in relation to creating income opportunities for women, creating support groups for women. These are already existing change agents, and what we're doing is working with those agents bottom up as a way of like creating enabling environment for these groups to kind of continue the chain that they've already started initiating. So therefore, we're not coming in with what we are perceived to be a more equitable representation or what we think to be an empowering solution, but actually working with the solution that people are already coming up with. So that I think is something that's been very helpful in this landscape as a way of avoiding sort of patronizing more colonial approach of a top-down approach of effecting change. Kirsty, I don't know if you want to add to this, and I don't know if I've addressed this adequately.
Oh, I think your comments are fantastic. Thanks, Bethy.
Okay, are we good?
Thank you very much.
I know I've got Margarida wants to ask a question, and I said I would close our chat. I think we need longer sessions, it looks like, isn't it? So I'll leave it to you girls. I don't want to, take your whole day. Are you okay to answer the last question?
No, happy to engage with Margarida. Hi.
Margarida, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I am Margarida. I'm working in population and conservation genetics, so I don't work in this field, but I'm really passionate about, and I want to do a PhD in this field. So I don't know if my question is very related. It is related to the topic. I wanted to hear your opinion on using on conservation basic income as a tool to promote coexistence. What do you think about it? And who should be the people even receiving in the community? Because this will also be like a controversy probably. I don't know, what do you think about it? And thank you so much for all the knowledge you shared. Thank you so much. The projects are amazing.
I think this topic is just something that we started considering just conceptually. There was a horizon scan published earlier this year on future directions for community-based conservation. I'm trying to think of the lead author. I'll send that one to Adriana. You can circulate it. Nafisa is her name, and so there's a section on conservation basic income. So that's how our group we used it as a journal club, but we haven't considered it with these particular programs. I think the other group that I have read about that's really focused on this, I want to say that their group name's called Convivial Conservation, and so I think that those maybe two areas would be places to kind of get more information, further engaged. But Bethy, is there something that you want to share or say?
No, I was just going to refer to that article too, because we recently came across it. But yeah, definitely happy to continue conversations, if you have questions about that based on our discussion.
Thank you so much. I will do that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to say again, thank you so much, Bethy and Kirsty, for accepting our invitation, for giving such wonderful talks with so much material and food for thought. I think there are a few themes that came up, and we'll probably go follow up. I think we need to do a session on indigenous perspectives in conservation in general, in conservation translocations, and other ideas. So yes, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone who is still here, and I'll be sharing the recording and the resources with everyone. Okay, and hopefully see you next week.
Yeah, we'll see you.
Have a lovely day. I've got trick-or-treaters coming to the door, one after another. My husband is running around with sweets.
All right.
So
see you,
happy Halloween.
Thank you.
Halloween.
Thanks.